So, finally, we look at the third section of the NSPE code, the so-called professional obligations. I suppose if I read this a little more closely, I might know why they call this section professional obligations. It seems that the whole thing is about professional obligations, but that's what it's called. Um, you know, what is a code of ethics for a profession? What are professional ethics? Well, you can think of it in terms of obligations, I suppose. That is, you are a practicing engineer, and as a person in that role, you instantly have obligations because you play that role, because you've filled that role. But to whom are your obligations? Well, first of all, as is stressed in the canons, to the public. You have an obligation not to imperil the public. You have an obligation to hold public safety and welfare paramount. So you have an obligation to the public, but we're reminded that you have an obligation also to your client or employer, depending upon the nature of your situation. So you have a second duty, a major duty to the client or employer. But as a member of the profession, you also have duties and obligations to other members of the profession, and not everything in this section deals with that, but just for instance, looking at, again, section 3 of the code, number, I'm sorry, I can find it. I'm trying to find the section that actually deals with how you should and shouldn't deal with other engineers. Sorry. Well, for instance, number 9, engineers shall give credit for engineering work to those to whom credit is due and will recognize the proprietary interests of others. That seems to be about how you deal with other engineers, acknowledging their work and giving them credit. Let's see. Yeah, number 7 is really what I was thinking of. Engineers shall not attempt to injure maliciously or falsely, directly or indirectly, the professional reputation, prospects, practice, or employment of other engineers. That is professional courtesy, it's sometimes called, but also a kind of, at one time it might have been called a kind of a brotherhood, which of course is a sisterhood now. So it's almost a filial, I guess, relationship between engineers. And engineers look out for each other, and engineers owe each other certain duties, that they can trust each other, and that this has, for instance, has a lot of it has to do with this has a lot to do with the strictures on advertising in engineering, which we'll look a little bit at. That is, you can't sort of slander or even imply that other engineers are incompetent or that you're better than them, because that would violate kind of the code. You know, an engineering society or profession in general is not just an organization that is put together so that members of the profession can better serve the public. It is that, but it is also a self-protective measure. That is, members of the profession protect each other, and the profession protects itself, and so you have obligations which are pointed out here to other engineers. Other interesting things in here, for instance, section 5, engineers shall not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. A conflict of interest is a very interesting subject in any professional ethics because of its relation to the nature of professions itself. We'll be getting into what a real conflict of interest is. I think that most of us don't have a very clear idea of what a conflict of interest is. But I'll just say it now. A conflict of interest is not a conflict between two different interests, really. A conflict of interest is a conflict between a duty or obligation that you have and some other interest that may conflict with your carrying out that duty in a proper and impartial way. So we'll get to things like that. So that is, my commentary on the NSPE Code of Ethics for Engineers. There are other codes. There are codes that are specific to different fields. There's a code for civil engineers and mechanical engineers. There's a code for software engineers and electrical engineers. Kind of thought that software engineers were electrical engineers, but I guess they're not. Because you need electricity to run something, right? Software. But my education and continuing. But that's my commentary on the code. I want you to read through this code. I want you to become familiar with it. I take the code seriously. I think that in an engineering ethics course, to ignore the fact that there are these codes of ethics for engineers would be ridiculous. I mean, they're there, and they're meant by your forebears, by your ancestors, engineers, to guide you in your practice. So we'll pay very close attention to this code of ethics.